Good afternoon. Today we're having a bit of a casual, a relaxed stream. Not a great deal of prep has gone into this, but we're going to be rewatching Lecture 1 from Jordan Peterson's biblical series. How are you doing, Black Horse?
I'm doing okay. I'm breaking my own rule about prep here. When I was in university, a professor I had gave me the advice that you should do 3 hours of prep for every hour of discussion you hold. And it's been a great rule for business and for other things, but we're going to go for the natural reaction feel here today.
We'll see how it goes. Maybe we'll both regret it. Just a word on Jordan Peterson in general. I feel like I've probably done my fair bit of cynical Jordan Peterson bashing in the last few months. But back when these lectures were coming out, I was a big Jordan Peterson viewer. I watched, I think, his entire Maps of Meaning lecture series, possibly more than once, and found it really interesting. And yeah, I was fascinated by this when it was happening. And I continue to think Jordan Peterson's a very interesting person to listen to, and he's got a lot of spot on ideas. But I'm sure as we're listening to this, we may discover our points of difference. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I think he's a very interesting figure. In point of fact, I attempted to be in his class back before he was famous. When I was at school.
Yes. That wouldn't have been a possibility for me, but
yeah, no,
that would have been fun.
It would have been fun. I was waitlisted for the course, and waitlists don't always work out. But I owe him a tremendous debt in opening my mind to objective aesthetics. So if you look at his Maps of Meaning lectures, the biblical studies lectures that we'll see today, and all of the analysis he's done of Disney movies, etc., one of the things he gets at, which is really interesting, is the value of art and aesthetics at communicating vision. And this is something that I completely lost touch with when I was young. I grew up in a very depressing 1970s aesthetic around. I mean, my high school literally.
Beige.
Yeah, it had the school colors were brown and orange, and it had.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Reduced window capacity in order to save heat during the 1970s, fuel shortages. And I hated it, and I had no idea why I hated it. And then suddenly I was listening to lectures describe the visionary power of art, and like, oh, that's why I hated it. Anyways, it was an important moment in my own history. So
yeah, I think that that is. I'm just looking through the timestamps. We're having a look at the first biblical lecture, and there's some sections here that will, I think, touch back on some of those ideas. Obviously, if we're stopping and starting, and this lecture is already like 3 hours long, we're not going to be able to watch it all. But I think we've picked out some interesting highlights. Do we want to just maybe just to set things off? Why don't we just watch the very first couple of minutes? Because I don't know if you remember when this first happened, but it was quite a dramatic moment. Do you remember the first time you came across oh, Jordan Peterson, he's already a hot name in the media because of C16 and all this, and what he's decided to do with that attention is look at the Bible.
Yes, it was fascinating, especially for those of us who had been forwarding biblical ideas for a very long time with almost no attention. Yes. It was fascinating to see. I think he's the only public figure in Canada who's ever used their profile to discuss the Bible.
So you can hear in the audio, right, the sense of sort of strange anticipation and excitement. Something's about to happen. And what's that expression in his face? He is ready to go.
An expression you don't see in Peterson's face anymore.
No, true. But kind of he has a seriousness and a weight about him. Like he's not just there for entertainment, is he?
No,
He-
and we have to remember the moment that this is. What's the date on this lecture?
Good question. I can
I
find
think this
out.
is
I'll look that up
2015
in the
when this was
background.
first delivered.
Right. All right. Okay. I'll minimize the window so we can see. So the date was 2017.
Yeah, 2017. Very different world in 2017. I would say that it was about the time when our politics just started to get serious.
So 2017 in world politics, I guess this is the year after Trump. Maybe that's the most significant
This is
single event.
the year after Trump, so it's the year of cultural challenge. So,
Indeed. Oh, hang on.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's really shocking to me that you don't have anything better to do on a Tuesday night.
And that little off-cuff remark that he starts with sort of spawned a million Christian response videos of like, yeah, how come we can't pack out giant lecture halls full of non-Christians just to talk about the Bible? Have we missed a trick this whole, for the last 2,000 years? What's going on?
No, seriously though, it is. I mean,
Yeah. Okay. So unless you had anything else to mention about the beginning, let's skip forwards because it's all interesting. Go and watch it if you haven't already. But he does a massive intro where he starts talking about Nietzsche and the sort of the human spirit in general. And he kind of sets himself up like he's claiming his approach is as a psychologist, which allows him to remain somewhat ambivalent on some of the harder questions for a while at least.
Yeah.
All right. Should we watch?
Get back to that? Yep.
Exactly.
Motivate an entire culture for 2,000 years and to transform the world. Like, what's going on? How did that happen? It's by no means obvious. And one of the things that bothers me about casual critics of religion is that they don't take the phenomena seriously. And it's a serious phenomena. I mean, not least because people have the capacity for religious experience and no one knows why that is. And I mean,
I think this is one of the things that was happening in 2017 was a transition away from the internet being a culture of new atheism towards what it is now, which I think is atheism. It has become a little bit cringe, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. This is the point at which the online subculture first addressed the deficit in the new atheist thinking about new atheist frame of the world. Whereas now, I don't think there are very many people who take the new atheist frame of the world seriously as a lens through which to view, just about anything.
And the part of the world that is ignored by the new atheist movement, I would summarize as being the spiritual. And although you can't measure our spiritual experiences using the scientific method, empiricism gives you no insight into giant swathes of the human experience. But nonetheless, anybody who is a human, i.e. all of us, deep down knows that there are things going on in the universe. There's stuff that needs explaining, that the kind of trite materialism is completely at a loose ends trying to talk about.
I also think he's pointing out the phenomena that went on in the world right about this time that the new atheist frame was completely incapable of explaining, and that's the mimetic phenomena. So the new atheist frame hadn't basically argued that religion was like a money con. But of course, even false religion is certainly not that. It's an innate human drive that exists in all cultures, both, I would argue, in genuine forms and in disingenuous forms. And so, like, when you look at the vast mimetic phenomena that went on between 2014 and 2017, the pure materialist reductionist view of religious expression had no frame to understand that, I would argue anyway.
It's ironic that Dawkins' own movement failed on mimetic grounds. That's quite funny. Should we let him carry on?
And you can induce it reliably in all sorts of different ways. You can do it with brain stimulation. You can certainly do it with drugs. There's especially the psychedelic variety. They produce intimations of the divine extraordinarily regularly. People have been using drugs like that for God only knows how long, 50,000 years, maybe.
Right. So what do you think about this claim then, that taking psychedelic substances gives you a genuine and comparable experience of the noumenal and the divine?
Yeah, I think it's a limited understanding of that experience. So, I mean, we've talked in our series of presentations about epistemology, levels of knowledge, and I've made the argument a few times here that that knowledge is tripartite, and so experience is actually tripartite, and you can. I have no doubt that you can induce an element of the experience of an encounter with God chemically, whether that's through, as he says, brain stimulation or through the use of psychedelics. I have no doubt that you can reproduce some of the experience of worship in that way. But in point of fact, when you induce that experience that way, you turn off the rational brain at the same time, which creates a very particular type of that experience. So if you compare and contrast this to the religious vision that's given to Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6, when he said, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple with the temple. Above him were the seraphs, each with 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they did fly. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. And the whole temple was filled with smoke, and the threshold shook. That's a vision that you can imagine seeing. You can imagine seeing a vision through chemically induced means, but the vision that you would see through chemically induced means wouldn't correspond to the rational view of God presented in the Old Testament in the same way that, say, Isaiah's vision corresponds to it, if you understand the point.
Certain Events is saying in chat that you're incorrect, that you do not turn off the rational brain with psychedelics. It's a plain disagreement.
Well,
or are you're saying that the psychedelic experience gives you an experience of the divine, but not on the rational level, just on purely.
Well, I'm saying it's a mimic, right? You can
Right.
you can turn on the same chemical processes that are turned on when you're experiencing the divine through. No different than you can simulate the smell of burnt toast by touching a part of your brain with an electrode. That doesn't make it the same as experiencing burnt toast.
Yeah, it is interesting that a lot of people have these sort of, they go off on a DMT trip for half an hour and then their entire life is changed and their whole worldview ever afterwards. I think the simplest explanation of this is just, well, they realized that there was more to the universe than, they'd kind of been jolted out of their mundane day-to-day mechanical lifestyle and were like, oh right, existence, oh yes, need to account for all of these phenomena that I can't simply put down to being part of
that's correct. It's no different
routine.
To lift at Jordan Petersonism. It's no different than when people encounter true malevolence who have no sort of theological grounding in it. Their whole world falls apart and they very often become victims of PTSD because they just have no frame for understanding that there exists some part of the world that just wants to hurt and kill them. In the same way, when you encounter a part of the world that is completely different than your previous frame, you're never going to be the same thereafter.
Yeah, exactly. Should we let Jordan talk a little more?
Maybe more than that.
I'm thinking our ratio
Produce
of
some
his
sort
talking
of
to our talking is
intimate union
concerning.
with the divine. It's like we don't understand any of that when we discovered the psychedelics in the late 60s. It shocked.
I don't think he means humanity discovered psychedelics in the late 60s, right? People have been messing around with this a little longer.
So badly that they were instantly made illegal and abandoned in terms of research for like 50 years. And it's no wonder, because who the hell expected that? Nobody. Now Jung was a student of Nietzsche's, you see, and he was also, I would say, a very astute critic of Nietzsche. He was educated by Freud, and Freud, I suppose, in some sense, started to collate the information that we had pertaining to the notion that people lived inside a dream. You know, it was Freud who really popularized the idea of the unconscious mind. And we take this for granted to such a degree today that we don't understand how revolutionary the idea was. Like with what's happened with Freud is that we've taken all the marrow.
I'd better pause. I'm too afraid to play too much in a single chunk. I guess what we're looking for, we're specifically looking for Christian and biblical ideas to talk about in the mix, I suppose. Because if we just have an unlimited conversation, this could go on forever.
Yeah, well,
But,
2 hours of lecture content. You figure 3 hours of discussion for every hour of lecture content. There's a lot to discuss.
Yeah, indeed. Who do you think the biggest influence on Jordan Peterson is? Because I feel like it's basically he could be described fairly accurately as a Carl Jung fanboy.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And in point of fact, his biblical lectures work so nicely because so much of Jung's theories are actually developed out of the Christian, out of the Old Testament. Right. So it's actually a really great way to explain Jung in the light of Old Testament stories.
It was interesting in his recent interview with Stephen Fry. He mentioned that because Fry said, well, a lot of your ideas are not very Nietzschean, given how much Peterson claims to love Nietzsche. And then Peterson said, yeah, well, there's this whole lesser known area of Carl Jung's writings where he's kind of responding to Nietzsche. And I guess if Nietzsche is attacking Christianity and then Jung's response is to defend Christianity, and then Peterson is modernizing Jung, and then all of the sort of Christians latch onto this as an updated response to new atheism. That's an interesting way to kind of recontextualize the Peterson phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly his defense of Christianity is certainly a defense of Christianity along the lines of Carl Jung. That's certainly an accurate characterization.
Yeah, right.
Out of his bones, so to speak, and left the husk behind. And you know, now when we think about Freud, we just think about the husk because that's everything that's been discarded. But so much of what he discovered is part of our popular conception now, including the idea that your perceptions and your actions and your thoughts are all, what would you say, informed and shaped by unconscious motivations that are not part of your voluntary control. And that's a very, very strange thing. It's one of the most unsettling things about the psychoanalytic theories, because the psychoanalytic theories are something like,
I'm waiting for the end of a sentence. Could be here for a while.
Living sub-personalities, each with its own set of motivations.
All right, let's pause there, because these sub-personalities thing, I love this idea, but I just wanted to say that is an interesting comment on Freud. And again, if we think about the dismissal of Freudian theories as being, non-empiric, there's no way to verify them, but they do appear to point towards something which has some power. That, you know, if people go for therapy session, people enjoy Freudian analysis and seem to get something out of it. And there's good reason, I would say, to think there's true and interesting ideas that are not verifiable empirically. And again, this leads us back round to the idea that Christianity also is a way of approaching ideas from a different route than simply following,
I
rigorous double-blind testing.
I also think there's a direct parallel here that's being made subtextually between the way that our culture has imbibed and anonymized the lessons that came from Freud, and the way that our culture has imbibed and anonymized the lessons that came from the Christian worldview. So, for example, the idea that there is objective truth that can be known and measured and that is repeatable is an idea that comes out of the idea that the world is created, that it operates according to the law of God. But that's not an idea that's ever attributed, or that is frequently attributed to Christianity any longer. It's just imbibed as part of our sort of milieu. And I think there's a direct parallel here with the idea that there is such a thing as an unconscious mind and competing motivational structures.
Mm-hmm. I want to just pause before we go on to our next section and quickly say hello to everyone in chat. Who have we had checking in so far? Mr. Patriarch, the OG. I'm never sure how to pronounce this, but you notice. Sorry if I'm not saying that right, but I think you were our first Twitch subscriber, so hello to you. Mongoose Man is looking forward to this. LaRue, good to see you, LaRue. I have to have you on stream again soon. The correct pronunciation of my name. Christine, trying to figure out why my name is always pronounced differently. There's only one man who knows how to pronounce it correctly, and that is Settler's Lament. And then let's see, Johnny the Great, and Christine, and Tom Herbert, and Simius the First. Oh, I can't just be listing people's names. Should we answer this question? What do we think of Jordan Peterson? As many on the right see him as too liberal. I think there's no doubt that he's trying to play down the middle. He's said as much himself, more or less, hasn't he? I mean, his two books, one was addressing an excess of order, the other excess of chaos. So he definitely views himself as a he
thinks that he's above it all and wants a healthy dialectic, and fair enough.
There's clearly there's clearly tribalism that's best avoided. So to that extent, it's a wise move. The more cynical side of me thinks that in the same way as he's able to talk to Christian audiences and ambiguously claim to believe in God, and then talk to atheists, and then slip into his more
whether he believes it or not, whether he believes it or not, it's a great marketing tool.
Exactly. Say no to Sumo. Well, I wouldn't be here without him. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to do this stream, really. And I think I'd quite like to do a few of them. I enjoy chunking on through his whole series. I thought it was great. And I know there's lots of people who have arrived at this channel through Jordan Peterson. So I think it's fitting that we do some kind of response. And I'm really keen to hear what everyone in chat's view, everyone in listening, what do they think? Drug experiences are aimless and erratic, whereas I assume a spiritual experience has or should have direct towards God and clarifying effect. What do you think of that?
Aimless and erratic. I'm not a subject matter expert on psychedelic experiences. I will say that from what I know of the literature concerning psychedelic experiences, it's fair to say that they don't follow strict rational or logical rules the way that you would expect. So, like if you look at scripture, even the parts of scripture that are outside of the physics of our world have strict rationality within themselves. Even the symbolic visions that you see in scripture have strict rationality within themselves. From what I understand of psychedelic experiences, the same is not necessarily true.
There's Bible verses that talk about, well, for example, in Proverbs, it says, what is it? Wine is a, I can't remember. Beer is a brawler, and wine is, I can't remember, some other negative characterization, talking about the mind-altering effects of alcohol in a negative way. It says, don't drink.
Beer is a brawler, wine is a mocker.
A mocker, thank you. Yes. So I wouldn't recommend going towards mind-altering substances as an attempt to find God. I think that's unwise. Similarly, for example, to how you can enjoy aspects of God's creation rightly in some circumstances, but in others is completely inappropriate. I'm not denying that.
Pretty straightforward scriptural instruction not to be out of our self-control. And if you are using psychedelic drugs, I think it's very hard to argue that you're not outside your self-control.
And then question from Philippocrit. What do you think about Freud as someone who recognized important biblical realities, but described them in a negative way, as though they were something we should out-evolve? Again, a way that Jung kind of differed from his mentors, in that, Jung took the idea. I don't know. Do you think Jung took things in a positive or a negative direction overall? I can see ways in which his approach has been magnified and turned into an unhelpful degree.
Well, I don't think it's negative or positive. I think you need to look at you need to look at Jung as a description of how things are organized in the human psyche. The fact that I think it's an effective descriptor, that the question is, why are things, or the deeper question is, why are things ordered that way in the human psyche? And that's not a question that that analytic figures like Freud or like Jung are positioned to make.
I mean, this concept that religion is something to out-evolve is definitely a phenomenon or a concept or an idea that we are pushed constantly, that is worth thinking about.
Well, I also think the presupposition that there's such a thing as the evolution of the human psyche or the evolution of human thinking is a fascinating concept. It's a concept really of that period between 1850 and maybe 1970. So like if you watch Star Trek, you see this idea that human beings are going to evolve beyond war, beyond poverty, all of this stuff. And nobody believes that anymore. Because I think in this particular historical moment, the entire theory of history that drove that narrative, that human society evolves rather than that human society evolves in that kind of way, is just it's just broken. People don't believe that anymore, and they don't believe.
Although I suspect young people generally always think this way, that you see one tyrant toppled in your lifetime. The first, you're a young teenager and you see some evil regime fall, and you think, well, there's only 20 other major tyrants in the world. Perhaps by the time I'm 30, we will have reached utopia. Yeah.
I think it's an extension of the same phenomenon that causes my 5-year-old daughter to roll her eyes at daddy when daddy just doesn't understand, right?
Yes. Like, if only you were as enlightened when you were 5 as she is now. Imagine what kind of a man you would be.
Well, I call her my 5-year-old teenager. So,
some of Freud seems to me to point to an idea of original sin, the id versus the superego, They also look to me like a conflict between angels and demons over an immortal soul. Do you get the impression in Freud that the id is perceived as negative?
I get the fundamental impression I get from Freud is it's a description of one of the ways in which our nature is broken. So if you look at the vision of God in the book of Ezekiel, where it talks about God pulled by a group of living creatures, and it says of the living creatures that every one of them goes straight forward. I've always found that image incredibly powerful because it's a direct contrast to the way that we are. None of us can ever be said in our lives to go straight forward. We're always going to the right or to the left. We're never pursuing our aims directly. We're never in perfect accord with our own principles of morality. And the creatures in heaven are perfectly oriented towards whatever their objective is. And Freud wonderfully describes these competing motivational structures that exist inside of us that are pulling us in 16 different directions. It's that struggle of the flesh versus the converted person. It's that struggle.
I was going to say it's interesting to compare these ideas from Freud to Romans 7. Go and read about how if I do not do what I want to do, it is not I that does it, but the sin within me. So there is this sense of the I, the Paul, being this super ego whose actions are often driven by the id. There is kind of there's nothing new under the sun, of course, but yes, some of what Freud says, he is merely bringing back ideas, but putting his own weird gloss over.
Well, and I mean, one of the things I think about it is that the fundamental insight is that the human person is fractured on the inside, that we've got competing motivational structures that are controlling our actions. And we don't understand that we have competing motivational structures. So we don't actually understand why we do things. And I think that insight very, very, very directly concords with the portrait of people in scripture. So like you can imagine this as the same people who sat at the bottom of Mount Sinai waiting for Moses to come down and decided to build a golden calf and worship it and thank it for taking the people out of Egypt, right? This is not a hyper rationalist controlled kind of picture of what human beings are. And I think that picture concords pretty directly with Freud.
Johnny the Great says, I imagine he's helped a lot of young men. However, there is certainly a reason YouTube promotes him so much. ... Well, we will let our viewers speculate about that one. But if the algorithm is promoting him, we're here for the ride. Okay, that's probably enough of a pause. Should we? We've jumped on in the lecture a little bit, and I think he's now going to talk about bear worship.
So they keep their information moving generation to generation. That's how they stay the same. And so we know, again, in the archaeological record, there are records of rituals that have remained relatively unbroken for up to 20,000 years. It was discovered in caves in Japan that were set up for a particular kind of bear worship that was also characteristic of Western Europe. So these things can last for very long periods of time. We're watching each other act in the world. And then the question is, well, how long have we been watching each other? And the answer to that, in some sense, is, well, as long as there's been creatures with...
another big influence on Peterson, of course, is Joseph Campbell. And he brings quite a lot of this comparative religion stuff with him, doesn't he? So there's a sense in which a lot of the Orthodox Christian, pastors and public figures were very excited about watching this content, because here was Peterson criticizing the atheists for missing the point. Yep. But actually, the underlying assumptions he's bringing here is that there's a fabric of religion all across the world going back for ultimately tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, almost emerging out of animals from an evolutionary, this is evo psych applied to religion. And therefore, some of what he says about the Bible comes from it at that perspective of saying this is merely an encoding into text of complicated metaphorical behaviors and ideas that aren't even they're not thought of by an individual, but they're taught ritually and then eventually encoded in stories, and that as enlightened 21st century thinkers, we can start to pick apart the stories and discover that, that story about Cain and Abel, forget the bit about God. What it's really about is some woolly self-help kind of outcome.
Well, but this is a fundamental part of his epistemology. So Jordan Peterson is a phenomenological thinker, which means he's concerned with the outcome rather than the underlying logic of a set of processes. So when he looks at some people worshiping bears in a cave, he's not concerned with the logical framework that has driven these people to worship bears in a cave. He's almost considers that an irrelevancy. He's concerned with, to him, worshiping bears in a cave looks a lot like going to an oracle on a mountain in Delphi, looks a lot like going to like a 13th century monastery somewhere in the north of England hiding from Vikings. He's concerned from a phenomenological perspective, these things are fundamentally the same, whereas from a different epistemological frame, they're radically different.
He kind of, well, maybe not Peterson in particular, but there is, I think, commonly perceived that there is a progression from people living tribally and separately and worshipping their own gods, thinking that God is, that their little religion, parochial religion, is universal, and then discovering through a kind of globalization that, actually all of us are doing the same thing but from different perspectives. Whereas I'd actually argue that it's the other way around, isn't it? That most Judeo-Christian religions are kind of pantheistic. They all say, well, this is our God, but if you have a God over there, then I guess they're all, maybe our gods will meet up someday. The concept that there is any universality to God is kind of is extremely unusual conception.
Yeah, I mean, the exclusive claim is it's not unique to Christianity, but it's certainly the minority of religious traditions possess it, and religious traditions that possess an exclusive claim have an interesting phenomena in that they have a tendency that they have a man-limiting principle. So if you look at an example of a religious tradition that has an exclusive claim that does not have a limiting principle, that's Islam, right? Islam has an exclusive claim as to who God is, and it has a universal position that everyone ought to accept that exclusive claim. And not only that everyone ought to accept that universal claim, that you're justified in the exercise of force in order to drive its acceptance. Well, Judaism is an example of an exclusive claim that is limited by a concept of a nation. So all Jews should accept this universal claim. And then Christianity, I suppose, is limited by the concept of the will, that everyone who can come. I mean, you're going to see a distinction between the Calvinists and the non-Calvinists here. Basically, everyone who's enabled by God to come should come, rather than, and so you have kind of two examples of a limiting principle, one example of no limiting principle to an exclusive claim. It's an interesting. I'm not aware of any other exclusive claim religious groups at a large scale.
But in some sense, I think there is wisdom in Peterson's view that you don't have to understand every why to get involved. So I don't want to fully endorse his approach here, but there is a certain mindset which says I've got to dot every I and cross every T. And once I've fully figured out who God is and his stance on every moral issue, then maybe I'll consider going to church. And actually, there's great wisdom in doing the things that the people who you admire do, not in an absence of understanding. So I kind of agree that even in just seeing that people do worship, you learn that worship is important, and even if you don't understand why, it's kind of like in Acts when Paul is talking to those people, he says, you're a very religious people. I see you've got plinths, you've got even one up here to an unknown God. Well, great that you're religious. God, yeah. Now let me explain. Yeah.
I think this point can be elaborated on by imagining yourself as an idiot. So, hypothetically for everyone here, because everyone here is a genius, but hypothetically imagine that you're the stupidest person in a crowd of 100 people. It means you want to outsource some of your decision making.
Yes.
And there's a reality in which, at least to a certain extent, we ought to get signals that ideas are worth exploring from the presence of admirable people exploring those ideas.
Right, let's let him talk about Bears a bit more.
That's a long time. That's some hundreds of millions of years, perhaps longer than that. We've been watching each other.
Hundreds of millions of years. I sold him short saying hundreds of thousands. It's out by a factor of a thousand.
This is going back to the law.
What we're up
yeah, this is
to across that entire span of time. And some of that knowledge is built right into our bodies, which is why we can dance with each other, for example, right? Because understanding isn't just something that you have as an abstraction. It's something that you act out. That's what children are doing when they're learning to rough and tumble plays. They're learning to integrate their body with the body of.
I do love how he integrates all these different fields. He doesn't feel constrained. On the one hand, I'm annoyed when people are an expert on one topic and then they start talking across all topics as if they know what they're saying. But actually,
well, if you're purporting yourself to be an expert on human psychology spans a lot of fields.
Maybe that's the trick. But in a way, if you're a very narrow subject matter expert, you don't even understand your own subject because you don't have it in context. Have you heard this concept of a T-shaped engineer? It's kind of a funny term, right?
Yeah.
But like you're T-shaped because if you imagine you have either wide knowledge or deep knowledge, but a T-shaped engineer, the concept is that you understand a lot of engineering at a shallow enough level to be useful, and then you have one speciality where you go very deep. And if you're genuinely T-shaped across your life, if you have a thirst for understanding and knowledge and a joy in discovery across everything in the world, you will start to make connections that you haven't even heard anybody make before. But you hear, somebody say something interesting in one context and another context, and you're the only person you ever come across who's interested to that degree in both things, and you suddenly make this connection and you go, oh, wow. Or a similar example is like in maths, all the time you pound away at a problem using, say it's a geometric problem. You're using your geometric tools. Then you translate the problem. You say, okay, it's equivalent to this other problem, but in number theory. And now I've got a different set of tools, and you can make progress.
Yeah, no. When I was a physics student, I found this. There's an experience as a physics student when you learn the physics before you learn the math. where you kind of, as you unlock the mathematical tools that were used to create the constructs in physics that you're working with, there's an aha moment when you realize that, at the high school level, when you realize that the laws of motion that you're made to memorize are actually an outcome of basic calculus.
Yes, that's
so
cool. That is cool.
When I was in about 11th grade, I had this moment where I realized that all of the formulas that I had been made to memorize in physics could all be derived trivially using fundamental calculus. And it's I never quite looked at either the process of memorizing formulas the same again, or what exactly it was I was doing in physics the same way again.
And just to say, when the universities were started, it was sort of viewed that all of the different types of study people could do were ultimately theology of one sort and or another. I think that really is true. When we discover something new about the world, you should always be on the lookout for ways that it reflects back to ultimately either God's good design and his amazing nature, or the way that sin has messed things up, crossing. So you think, I don't know, he's talking about dance. Well, we see dance mentioned lots of times in the Bible, and you can say, okay, interesting ideas from. I mean, we're not going to do this now, but it'd be interesting exercise for the reader. Make connections between Bible verses talking about dance and some of Peterson's ideas here.
Yeah. Well, why don't we finish out what Peterson has to say?
Someone else in a harmonious way, learning to cooperate and compete, and that's
Sorry, I know this is going slow.
instantiated right into their body. It's not abstract knowledge. They don't know that they're doing that. They're just doing it. And so we can even use our body as a representational platform. So we've been studying each other for a long time.
Can we stop there for a second?
Yeah.
So this idea that your body is a platform for ideas that you don't understand. This is a really important religious idea. What do you make of this?
Well, it immediately brings to mind the verse about using your body as a living sacrifice, and the fact that the fact that we our actions, the things that we do, can drive our beliefs. We always think of it the other way around, but actually I think it's often this way. If you Peterson says, do you believe in God? I act as though I believe in God. In a sense, if you spend your entire life deliberately trying to act as if God doesn't exist, in a sense, it was your decision to act in that way that means that you don't believe in him. And the flip side is true as well. If you're struggling to believe in God, I talk to people a lot who say, I just can't believe. Or I want to believe. I want to reach out to God. I want a personal relationship. And I think often the best advice is just start acting as if that was already the way that you felt. Put time aside for prayer, go to church, read the Bible. Even if you don't yet feel you're at the stage where it is derived from a real belief, but you will find that practice eventually aligns with your spirit.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was at all what you were thinking there.
No, it's the application of the principle. I think it's really interesting that you have, I don't know, it's a very interesting idea, because you have at the same time, so if you look at the books of the law, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, you have maybe 80% of the commands are to do things, and maybe 20% of the commands are to communicate the law.
Interesting. Yes. Yeah.
And even the commands to communicate the law. So if you look at Deuteronomy 6, where it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And these commandments I give to you are to be upon your hearts. Teach them to your children." Then it goes on to spend the rest of the paragraph saying things like, talk about them while you're on the road, inscribe them over your doorposts. It's all these actions that you're to take in order to imprint the commands of God onto your heart. So even when you're discussing passing on intellectual constructs, you're described as passing them on in these kind of physically engaging ways. Bind them around your forehead or whatever. I don't know what bind them around your forehead means, but it's certainly physical in a way that sitting in a lecture hall isn't physical, right?
Exactly. The other thing that just came to my mind was, remember in James 2, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such a faith save them?
Yeah.
Which is kind of, I mean, you mentioned Calvinism earlier, right?
It's the modernist misunderstanding of what faith actually is.
Hmm.
Faith isn't an intellectual belief.
Yeah.
The same way as if you say you believe an airplane can fly, but you refuse to get in the airplane, do you really believe the airplane can fly? Well, depends what you mean by believe.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. In some ways, we discover our own beliefs more as if we were an outside observer than through introspection. If you think that you believe something and then you act differently, you've kind of learned that you didn't really believe it in the first place.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I don't think it's the case.
To this dialogue we were discussing earlier about the extent to which you create yourself and the extent to which you discover yourself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, should we let him carry on?
Sure.
What is it that we're up to? And that's what is it we're up to? What should we be up to? That's even a more fundamental question. If you're going to live in the world and you're going to do it properly, what does properly mean? And how is it that you might go about that? Well, it's the right question, right? It's what everyone wants to know. How do you live in the world? Not what is the world made of? It's not the same question. How do you live in the world? It's the eternal.
I would argue the question is, how should you live in the world? Because a lot of people kind of go through their day-to-day trying to distract themselves and not think about big questions. In my experience, I think apathy is more often than confusion and mystery what I come up against when I'm trying to talk to people about big questions. They don't want to, they fundamentally are more interested in happiness than bigger morality questions. Maybe that's just a symptom of living in such a wealthy country.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated. I think a lot of that has to do with not wanting to look at yourself. Like it's one of the fundamental things that I observe about people, that they do not. It's not as much that they're incapable of introspection; it's that they're willfully opposed to introspection.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
If you turn the gaze inward, what you'll discover is that Romans 3 is true, that you're full of sin.
Yes. And this is something that Peterson, I mean, he is probably one of the most introspective people when he talks about, thinking about the Holocaust, and his reflection on that is mostly, it could have been me.
Yes, I could have been the perpetrator rather than I could have been the victim.
Yeah, which is right. That is the right attitude when you think about evil. Is fundamentally like, if it was not for the sacrifice of Jesus, I am as culpable as anybody, and am that twisted and evil. And when you realize the depths of depravity and how great God is in comparison, it should first start with our own heart and not pointing at other people.
Well, the argument from the common grace of God is that everyone is that concentration camp guard. And
right.
It's only either the common grace of God or the transformation of the Spirit that makes us anything but that. And I think when people turn their eyes on themselves in a meaningful way, they notice it, and it's disturbing.
Eternal question of human beings. And I guess we're the only species that has ever really asked that question, because all the other animals, they just go and do whatever they do, not us. It's a question for us. We have to become aware of it. We have to be able to speak it. God only knows why, but that seems to be the situation. So we act, that acting is shaped by the world, that acting is shaped by society into something that we don't understand, but that we can model. We model it in our stories, we model it with our...
That's an interesting way of phrasing it, a very Peterson way of thinking. We don't understand it, but we can model it. I think he kind of does think that way about all knowledge. There's this kind of barrier between what he can know and almost everything in the universe that he sees as unbridgeable. So he's putting it here in the perspective narrowly of just human behavior, but I actually think he has this epistemic problem to vast degrees, which is why he ends up with this extreme version of pragmatism. So he says, I can't know anything, and therefore all I can do is pretend that the things that I have in my brain are reality, and then choose to act as if I believed that they were real. And he's kind of advocating the same thing here for analyzing human society. It's like, we don't really understand complex, human society, but at least we can...
It's the phenomenological outlook applied at the individual level. So it's not just, I don't understand human society. It's that I don't even understand why I do what I do. All I can do is evaluate the phenomenology of it, which is, it's interesting.
So for people who aren't aware, phenomenology, do you want to explain what that is?
So it's the idea that you evaluate the aesthetic character of a thing rather than the logical roots of a thing. So maybe to provide a simple understanding, my 5-year-old can give you the phenomenology of a tree. It's got leaves, it's got branches, it grows in this sort of shape. It starts as an acorn and it grows up to be 80 feet tall and it lasts 200 years. That's the phenomenology of a tree. Whereas the logical grounding of a tree would be something like a detailed understanding of the systems that cause the acorn to open up and how it draws water out of the ground and the photosynthetic process that it uses to make its food and all of the other various processes. There's limits to my understanding of how trees grow, but you would have to understand all the logical underpinnings from protein molecules all the way out to the systems analysis in order to understand a tree from a sort of a direct point of view. And Peterson is making the same argument about human behavior, that we can observe. There's a layer at which our observations rest, which we can call the phenomenology of human behavior, but we have no hope of delving into the deep well of the roots of those behaviors.
There's a thought experiment, isn't there, of Mary the color scientist? The idea being that she knows everything there is to know about the color red, but she's colorblind. So what is she? So she knows like the exact frequencies. She understands the history of the color red, how it's been used through societies to and she's image of blood and anger, but yet she's never seen the color red. So what is it that she's missing in her knowledge? And that difference is the phenomenological layer. It's those things about what it is to experience the color red. And in a strange way, Peterson's view is almost that the phenomenological is the only thing that we have real confidence in or direct access to.
He's the anti-color scientist. He believes that
yes,
either that's the only observation we really have, or it's the only observation we really can make. It's not clear which is the case.
Bodies, and that's where the dream gets its information. The dream is part of the process that's watching everything and then trying to formulate it and trying to say, trying to get the signal out from the noise and to portray it in dramatic form, because a dream is a little drama. And then you get the chance to talk about what that dream is. And then you have something like articulated knowledge at that point. And so the Bible, I would say, is it's sort of, it exists in that space that's half into the dream and half into articulated knowledge. It's something like that. And going into it to find out what the stories are about it can aid our self-understanding. And then the other issue is that.
So, I mean, clear Freudian influence here, being fascinated with dreams. But I think a lot of people, when they come across Peterson, these are things they've never heard before. He's bringing them ideas that are kind of undeniably interesting. There's something to a lot of what he's saying that's it's just intuitively correct, isn't it? That there is something magical and interesting and unknowable about myths and dreams, and you want to go on the adventure and kind of discover the hidden truths. It's the kind of adventure that we often feel we're missing in the modern world, where everything is kind of explained and explored to the nth degree, and you can just Google it.
It's sort of odd because it looks at these areas of ancient interest. I mean, you go back thousands and thousands of years, and people are trying to understand their dreams. You go back thousands and thousands of years, people are obsessively teaching myths and legends to their children. And if you look at just the fraction of modern life that's devoted to these things versus the fraction of ancient life that's devoted to these things, the contrast is stark. You go back and look at some of the early biblical stories about dreams, and you see whether it's Pharaoh in the time of Joseph, or whether it's Nebuchadnezzar in the time of Daniel, you see powerful, important men who just bring the whole kingdom to a stop as a result of a dream, and are in our world where we are basically taught to dismiss dreams. It's an interesting contrast.
But it's interesting, the journey that I think a lot of the people like Say No to Soma, which is an interesting, given our talk of psychedelics, and your username is making me think. But so Say No to Soma was saying, I've come here through Peterson. So the journey is first you're confronted with this kind of affronting new atheist attitude of, well, this is all rubbish, you know, just live in the mundane. And then you kind of imbibe that and say, okay, all right, I'll throw religion out, baby out with the bathwater, as it were. And then Peterson's framing says, you don't need to believe any of this stuff is actually real. You can take the Bible and say it can still teach us things, but you have to be really smart to kind of pull it apart from its, you almost want to disentangle the supernatural claims from what it is, which is kind of a, in his view, a synthesizing of wisdom, kind of collected together over many, many generations. And surely there's something important for you as an individual to learn from the evaporated remains of all the lives of your ancestors. And then people start exploring, and then what they discover is, oh, actually, no, the Bible makes a lot of sense literally. And I hope that that's what people kind of start to question and say, actually, can I go further than the Jordan Peterson view of Christianity as being a valuable tool for navigating modern life, and say, oh, actually, no, I want to do the full circle and get back to where I started, which is in believing Christianity is a religion with direct truth claims.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you start to evaluate it on the Jordan Peterson level, it's hard to be logically consistent and do that. That's very much part of the motivation for this deep phenomenological claim or frame, because if you evaluate Christianity phenomenologically, it's the only lens through which you can evaluate it, where you don't have to evaluate directly the claims of Jesus to be the embodied Son of God. So the only way you can look at the text without having to address claims like that is to look at it phenomenologically, so you can avoid looking at the logical foundations.
And there's certainly enough people in the Bible who were, to all appearances, fully orthodox, fully inside the faith, either Jewish, say, take the Pharisees as an example. They showed every outward appearance, and their lifestyle reflected fully the fact that they would be believers in God. And yet Jesus' analysis on them was scathing, that they fundamentally were not going, they would even come to him on the last, on the day of judgment and say, Lord, Lord, did I not cast out demons in your name and prophesy for you? And he'd say, away from me, you evildoers, I never knew you. So there is this
the Sermon on the Mount is an anti-phenomenological
interesting
document, right? So when it says something like, you've heard it said, do not commit murder. Anyone who commits murder will be guilty of sin. But I tell you the truth, anyone who is angry with his brother has committed sin in his heart. That's an explicitly anti-phenomenological claim, right? The claim is that your motivational structure matters, not just the things that you do. It's this idea from the evaluation of David that God looks at the heart, even though man looks at the outward appearance. And you can make it a straightforward case that God can look at the heart in a way that we just can't. And, we're restricted to the phenomenological frame to an extent, but certainly God's not restricted to that frame.
This next section has been helpfully titled by somebody in the comments section, Phenomenological It Matters. So this should be very relevant. It will almost be like Peterson is responding to us rather than the other way around.
So I want it all laid out causally so that B follows A and B precedes C, and in a way that's understandable and doesn't require any unnecessary leap of faith. Because that's another thing that I think interferes with our relationship with a collection of books like the Bible, is that you're called upon to believe things that no one can believe. And that's no good, because that's a form of lie as far as I can tell. And then you have to scrap the whole thing, because in principle the whole thing's about truth. And if you have to start your pursuit of truth by swallowing a bunch of lies, then how in the world are you going to get anywhere with that?
Which is actually kind of Hitchens' refutation of the was it the who is it who said you have to either choose whether to believe in God or not, but when you die, if you believed in God, you're all good, but if you didn't believe in God, then you it's no help to you to have been correct at that point. Sorry,
Pascal's wager.
Pascal, thank you. Yeah, so the Pascal's wager, Hitchens' response is, well, if I choose to believe something just in order for it to have a practical end, I've actually undermined my own. It's supposed to be about truth seeking, like Peterson just said.
But this is that, Peterson's argument here can actually be recast as a Calvinist idea that you have to be enabled to believe in order to believe, which is very. I mean, this is a degree of. We'd be splitting theological hairs here between our audience if we went down that particular rabbit hole. But you can certainly make the argument from Romans 12 that maybe it's not inconsistent with the Bible that many people can't believe these things.
It also reminds me of the beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. It's like, well, that's a real bootstrapping problem that you've created yourself. If I don't have any wisdom, how am I going to get wisdom if the beginning of wisdom is getting wisdom? So there's this interesting kind of, either you've got the process rolling, and in some ways, if you're worried about your eternal salvation, that itself is a good sign, right? There's a grain of hope for you on which you can build. The mere fact that it's a concern to you is itself a positive sign. That's almost the other one. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. Like,
That's
the
right.
fact
And
that
you
you're
could all go
asking the
back and
question.
listen to our stream on the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Exactly. It's this channel is nothing but an intricate web of self-reference. I know it's just because we talk about the Bible, right?
And so I don't want any uncertainty at the bottom of this, or I don't want any more than I can get, than I have to leave in it, because I can't get any farther than that. And so it's going to make sense rationally. I don't want it to be pushing up against what we know to be scientifically untrue, even though science is in flux, and that's, you know, somewhat of a dangerous parameter. If it isn't working with evolutionary theory, for example, then I think that it's not a good enough solution.
I can kind of sense here he's somewhat in his mind in conversation with some of his academic colleagues who I think would belittle a lot of his ideas. And he's trying to say, no, I am rational. I care about things making sense. Don't dismiss a lot of my fanciful ideas, because I really take them seriously. I don't know. Maybe I'm speculating, but
Well, I think
that's it.
I think the dialogue here is a reflection of sitting in many faculty lounges with many new atheists.
Exactly. Yeah. And although they're not up on stage here to give their arguments,
Well,
I mean, both of us
we're
at
always
least.
in dialogue with the people who are in our mind, right? I'll never be outside of dialogue with my father, right? I'll never be free of it.
Yeah. Either you're an unconscious, either you're unconsciously living inside somebody else's frame, or you're trying to break out of it.
So,
Yeah.
And then finally, it's phenomenological.
Here we go.
Modern people, you know, we think of reality as objective, and that's very powerful. But that isn't how we experience reality. We have our domain of experience, you know, and this is a hard thing to get a grip on, even though it should be the most obvious thing. For the phenomenologists, everything that you experience is real. And so they're interested in the structure of your subjective experience. And you say, well, you have subjective experience.
Yeah. So if you really think hard about it, you can't get beyond mere, you know, on a logical basis, you can't get beyond complete skepticism about everything. So there's kind of this interesting philosophical exercise that seems to happen, or at least this happened to me, and I've heard people say the same thing, right? You start questioning things, and you go and look up what the best answers are, and the answers aren't convincing. And then you end up realizing that it's much easier to tear down ideas than to build them back up. Descartes, who you know, he came up with I think, therefore I am, and that was following his extensive attempts to show that all the things that he put stock in could not be believed. Like he said, well, what if you know, okay, I think that I'm in a room here with a podcasting mic and a camera.
I think therefore I am is also deeply intellectually unsatisfying.
Yeah. And so he said, okay, it could be a demon is feeding my senses, making me think that I'm in this room broadcasting on YouTube. And in fact, I'm not. And he eventually broke it down until he believed pretty much nothing. And then he started by saying, okay, well, I think, it can't be denied by this sentence, and therefore at least I exist. But a lot of people have commented that he was much more successful in the first half of his endeavors than the second, because he more or less spawned skepticism. And I think phenomenologists are, in a way, a brand of extreme skeptics or kind of solipsists. Is that fair to say, that they don't fundamentally have any reason to believe in the objective morality or objective reality of outside objects beyond them being theoretic?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable. I mean, it's a complicated thing, but I think that's a reasonable frame to begin with in your discussion of them.
Should we let them go around?
Experience. You have subjective experience, so do you. And there's commonalities across all of those. Like, for example, you're likely to experience the same set of emotions. You know, we've been able to identify canonical emotions and canonical motivations. And without that, we couldn't even communicate, because you wouldn't know what the other person was like. You'd have to explain infinitely. There's nothing you could take for granted, but you can. You know, and phenomenology is the fact that in the center of my vision, my hands are very clear, and then out in the periphery, they disappear. And phenomenology is the way things smell and the way things taste and the fact that they matter. And so you could say in some sense that phenomenology is the study of what matters rather than matter. And it's a given from the phenomenological perspective that things have meaning. And you know, even if you're a rationalist, say, and a cynic and a nihilist, and you say, well, nothing has any meaning, you still run into the problem of pain, because pain...
I think this is the real intellectual journey that Peterson went on. He went deep into the Nietzschean kind of cave of horror and meaninglessness. And he's quite a neurotic character, right? He suffers and he's unhappy and feels pain. And then I think he somehow saw the pain as the route out of the existential crisis, which to some extent is valid, I think. You know, you.
Well, I mean, it's actually the biblical argument. Why does God make thorns grow? So that you'll look to him. So if you look at either Genesis 3, I think it's 3 where the curses come in, or Romans 8, where it talks about how all creation cries out in pains of childbirth. What it's telling you is that actually the reason why the ground is cursed is so that you look to God instead of look to the works of your own hands. So his journey out of the existential crisis is actually the journey out of the existential crisis that's prescribed in Scripture.
Mm-hmm. But the meaninglessness is also represented in Scripture. I think of large portions of Ecclesiastes, and even Lamentations.
Yeah, that's right. The journey that Peterson went on is a journey described in Scripture extensively.
Undercuts your arguments and has a meaning. So there's no escaping from the meaning. You can pretty much demolish all the positive parts of it, but trying to think your way out of the negative parts, man, good luck with that, because that just doesn't work. So phenomenology is, and the Bible stories, and I think this is true of fiction in general, is phenomenological. And it concentrates on trying to elucidate the nature of human experience, and that is not the same as the objective world. But it's also a form of truth, because it is truth that you have a field of experience and that it has qualities. The question is, what are the qualities? Now, ancient representations of reality were sort of a weird meld of observable phenomena, things that we would consider objective facts, and subjective truth, the projection of subjective truth. And I'll show you, for example, I'll show you how the Mesopotamians viewed the world. They had a.
I probably should pause. Yeah, again, similar framing. The Bible, he says, the biblical stories are phenomenological.
Yes.
I mean, if Peterson considers himself to be phenomenological at root, that's how he perceives everything. It should be no surprise that he reads these texts in that way. But I think where I would dispute this is there are objective truth claims in the Bible.
Well, the issue is, if the Bible is phenomenological, then you encounter the mystery of the first century. So you can't. We talked about this on a previous stream, but you've got 11 of the 12 disciples who are martyred for the claim that Jesus died and rose from the dead. All of whom claim to have witnessed it. All of whom had the opportunity to escape martyrdom by rejecting that claim. None of whom did. That's not a phenomenological claim. They're not claiming that the story of, or that the narrative character of the death and resurrection myth is correct. That's not what they didn't die for that. They died for an objective truth claim. And you got to confront that at some level.
And although you can compare Jesus to lots of other religious figures, there's other religious figures from pre-Christ who were born of a virgin or who died and came back to life in one way or another.
But that's what
Jesus
I say. That might be a phenomenological claim that it's that the religious claims of Christianity are similar to the religious claims of others. But that
Jesus also has
to come to grips with historical reality.
Exactly. There are specific places and people named in the Bible, and sources outside the Bible point back to Jesus's physical reality. So, I mean, and it's emphasized all the way through the New Testament that Jesus' physical body, his physical death and physical resurrection is absolutely critical. And the physicality of man is also, even though once our bodies die, we do not cease to exist. Nonetheless, being disembodied is not a comfortable or desirable.
Well, and if you look at the forward-looking prophecies in the New Testament, they suggest that there's bodily resurrection from the dead, that we don't exist in eternity future as disembodied spirits. We exist in eternity future as creatures with perfected bodies and perfected minds.
At a model, basically the world was a disc. If you go out in a field at night, what does the world look like? Well, it's a disc. It's got a dome on top of it. Well, that was basically the Mesopotamian view of the world, and the view of the world that the people who wrote the first stories in the Bible believed too. And on top of the dome there was water. Well, obviously it's like it rains, right? Where does the water come from? Well, there's water around the dome. And then there's land, that's the disc, and then underneath that there's water.
Actually, the first stories in the Bible talk about there being no rain and the water comes up from the earth to water.
How do you know that? Well, drill. You'll hit water. What's under the earth, obviously, because otherwise how would you hit the water? And then what's under that? There's fresh water. And then what's under that? Well, if you go to the edge of the disc, you hit the ocean. It's salt water. So it's a dome with water outside of it. And then it's a disc that the dome sits on. And then underneath that, there's fresh water. And then underneath that, there's salt water.
So I don't quite like the way he's framed it here. Maybe I'm just, again, being needlessly picky, but the phenomenological way to phrase this is that there is a truth to representing the sky as a dome. It's not a simplified understanding. It's not a lack of knowledge. It's a model of reality that works inside the domain in which it was supposed to operate. Maybe that is what he's trying to say, but it can sound like he's merely saying that the early humans writing the Bible were incorrect. They misunderstood the nature of reality. But I'm not sure that is actually what he's saying.
I don't think that's the actual claim. I think the correct way to interpret the claim is that what we would perceive to be misunderstandings are actually a representation along a different epistemological frame of reality. So the idea here is that the dome disk theory of reality actually is correct, even though it's different than how you would frame it from an objectivist point of view.
I'm having complaints from LaRue about saying that it's possible to continue to exist after your body has died.
Oh my goodness.
I'd probably want to reference, is it Thessalonians that says that, he
how about we
be
reference,
away from the body and go on.
How about we reference Revelation, where it says the spirits of the martyrs cry out to God before the bodily resurrection occurs.
All right, let's not get sidetracked. Sorry, Larry. I do enjoy your interjections there.
And that was roughly the Mesopotamian world. And you see that's a mix of observation and imagination, right? Because that isn't the world, but it is the way the world appears. It's a perfect.
it isn't the world, but it is the way the world appears. So he does still, there somewhere deep down, there is still a belief in objective morality.
Yeah, there is.
Quickly believable.
Go on.
We probably have to cut the stream pretty soon because we're at the 1.5 hour mark. But
Sure.
do we want to see if we can respond to some of the chat here before we let everybody go?
Good idea. All right. Well, we've I don't know if we've completely exhausted the first lecture there, but that's enough for today. Cool. Let's have a look. So yes, lots of people talking back and forth to each other. So we probably don't need to respond to that. Here's a couple of questions from Philopocrit. Okay. So Jane says, at least they always felt there's a higher being that looks after them, unlike the atheists now.
Okay.
Islam is just kind of a perverted Christianity, isn't it? I mean, I think all religions are a perverted form of the worship of the true God. I wouldn't call out Islam in particular for being that. In some ways, there's the fact that Islam is closer to Christianity is a point in its favor.
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, sure. So you have to define how you each understand death. Yeah, this maybe is what ended up sparking other conversations with Louis. To me, death is. I think it's fair to say, from a biblical perspective, death is an enemy. It's always perceived in the negative light in the Bible as not natural, as opposite to God's order, and was kind of the phrasing of the initial consequences of sin. And it's ultimately only Jesus' conquering of death that brings final victory for God. I guess to answer on a more direct, practical level, when humans die, as in they have the funeral and so on, I would say they at that point, I don't know. Help me out here. What's the best way to phrase it?
The best way to describe death from a biblical point of view is that death is the temporary or permanent discontinuity of physical existence. So you see the first death described in Thessalonians as falling asleep. You see the second death described as eternal torment. But I don't know. It's.
I don't. Just because Philopocrit says we have to define it, don't you know?
Does it mean you have to define it? Oh dear.
All right. Let's see. A bunch of people. Oh, here's another question from Philopocrit. Dostoevsky speaks about ideas having people in his books demons, not the other way around. Sorry, I misread that. Dostoevsky speaks about ideas having people in his book demons and not the other way around. How much do you think demonology and psychology overlap? Oh, we're going to win over our Scientology friends if we start taking down psychologists.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's non-zero overlap.
It's interesting that Peterson never recommends people to go and have therapy, despite being a psychologist. In all his hours of advice, he never says go and get a therapy session, which kind of tells you maybe he doesn't think so highly of other psychologists.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. In Canada, if you offer exclusively talk therapy in your psychology practice, that's actually considered malpractice. It's grounds for a lawsuit.
Wow.
Which is fascinating on a number of levels. So,
although the fact that something is illegal usually makes me think it's probably quite a good idea.
Well,
in terms of ideas having people and not the other way around, that's also very interesting. And again, this is probably the same basic idea as memes, isn't it? That there's ideas and the people are merely the means for transmission of those ideas, and that evolutionary concepts can apply to those ideas.
Yeah, that's correct. This is a mimetic concept. This is the area where Peterson's frame, the religious frame, really just outperforms the materialist rationalist frame.
The problem, though, is that just because an idea is successful doesn't necessarily mean that it attaches to reality.
That's correct, which is why the rationalists can't understand mimetic expression, right? So why is it that an idea which is powerful but is not true can pass through a society very rapidly? There's an evolutionary psychology explanation for it, but the evolutionary psychology explanation for it falls down the minute you end up in Jonestown or the Soviet Union.
Right. I had a couple of people here in chat. Don't know how you can struggle to believe in God. Likewise, with me, it's the opposite. I can't not believe, no matter how much I neglect worship. It's already a part of me. I would say, praise God. That's fantastic for you. Don't take it for granted. It's not everybody's experience. But probably at root, like you were saying, Black Horse, a disbelief in God is probably ultimately, you can trace it back to your own sinfulness, and then even if it's so long ago that you can't remember, there was something within you that wanted to choose to disbelieve until it became an instinct.
And there's also the concept of generational sin, right? So the reality, when Exodus 20 says that God visits the sins of the father on the subsequent generations to the third and fourth generation, that's a description of the way in which the consequences of our broken lives are visited on our children. And one of the ways in which our broken lives are visited on our children certainly is the way that our early childhood plays out and how that influences our psychology for the rest of our lives.
What are your thoughts on meditation, mindfulness, yoga? These kind of, I guess that they're all similar in the sense that they require long periods of quiet and claim some spiritual benefits, but are taken up in a slightly new age way, especially in the business world.
Yeah. I don't know.
You could discover God through these means, I think, if you were genuinely, Jesus says, ask, seek, knock, right? Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. So
I also think there's tremendous value in spending time with yourself in order to have some introspective thought. So one of the things that I was challenged to do as a young man is to be alone with God for long periods of time, be able to go away to a quiet place and pray for 48 hours or something. I mean, if you look at what's recorded in scripture, very often Moses goes up on the mountain for 40 days. Jesus goes into the desert for 40 days. There's a long history to this practice of fasting, prayer,
yes,
and isolation. And there's an incredible richness that exists in that world. And it exists for two reasons that I can perceive. First of all, it exists because if you get away from other people, you have an opportunity in that moment to look at yourself you get an opportunity to stop looking at other people, because it's very hard to stop looking at other people. But the second is this idea that you're going to put everything else aside and focus on prayer, focus on God for a period of time. I don't know. I've had some of the most powerful insights I've ever had about God during periods like that, and insights about my own.
Yeah, and I also think it's really important in your life and on a regular basis to, again, externalize your priorities, as we were talking earlier, about how your actions are a reflection of your beliefs. If you say things like, I can't go a day without eating, or I can't go for an hour without entertainment, you're saying that you and God are not powerful enough to sustain life. You consider your top priority to be the food and comfort and entertainment and so on.
And then you embody that in your actions by never doing anything else.
Yeah, and so fasting, taking long periods of time out of life, spending time on godly things, focused, not as a side issue. That shows where your heart is, and it's also a practice that can break bad cycles and cause you to reevaluate and question. You thought that you didn't have time to pray in your week. You thought you were too busy. Well, what if you just decided that you were going to find that time like your life depended on it? Oh, it turns out you actually did have time, right?
Yeah, that's right. And also, I mean, many of the people in this chat might be too young to have children, but one of the things that you need to realize is that your life and your lifestyle is constantly communicating your priorities to your children, whether consciously or not. And so if you make a point that the very last thing that you have time for is your time in the Word or whatever, they're going to know that, right? Whereas if you communicate to them by your actions that you're going to take 48 hours and go on a weekend retreat, and we're going to pray for 48 hours, and I don't care that you're bored, there's something communicated embodied in those actions that's hard to, you probably couldn't communicate it any other way.
Yes. And especially for the slightly more sort of cognitively driven, thinky type people, it's really important to say over and over to yourself, like, there is more to life than what you think. Your actions are a part of you, as you're a human being. You're not just a kind of processing cog in a exactly. Like, you should think about what you do physically from morning to night as if you were, just thinking about yourself as a body and what you're choosing to do.
And this is one of my great critiques of the Western Church, particularly the Reformed traditions, that, sure, if we're all sitting around with 130 IQ, we can sit in a bare bones warehouse facility and worship God, because our worship, we can internalize our worship in a way that in a powerful way. But the reality is there's this huge part of the bell curve that's incapable of that experience, that deserves to encounter God and is equally valuable and of equal dignity before the Father. And there's also children, and they can't participate in that internalized experience in the same way. What are you going to do to address them in an aesthetic way?
I also think that's one of the reasons that, let me reshare it. This, at the very beginning of the lecture, when he, is it this one? This expression, right? Why is this powerful and worth commenting on? Why did I want to start here? Because he's not here just to entertain. Like, he's actually thinking, and you can see during the rest of the talk, you can see on his face, he's putting things together in his brain. It's like, this seriousness of purpose will affect the way that you live the rest of your life. I'm saying let's hold Jordan Peterson up as our only role model in life.
No different than showing up to church in jeans and a t-shirt versus showing up to church in a suit and tie affects your experience of church. And I'm not advocating for one over the other. It's just, be aware of what your actions are doing to yourself.
Yes, and it's, to some degree, I mean, the example of dress is an interesting one, because of course it's very cultural. If you were if you were in a different part of the world, you might be perceived as being formal by wearing slightly different set of clothes.
Yeah,
But the point is, what signals are you sending through? In some ways, the point is you took the time to consider your appearance and what you were trying to say. And the people, especially, of all the people on this stream, come from one of the more kind of relaxed Protestant Western kind of churches.
Yeah, I grew up that way as well.
And so a lot of people I mix with at church wouldn't get this intuition basically at all, and they're all for the iconoclastic modern perspective. But if someone shows up wearing a t-shirt with like profane language on it, for example, or was dressed immodestly, suddenly they would get the intuition. So
yeah, I didn't get this intuition at all until I was about 17, and I encountered a 25-year-old who had fetal alcohol syndrome. And I don't know what his IQ was, but it was, he was capable of formulating that his great ambition in life was to be able to drive a backhoe, and he was not going to be able to drive a backhoe. He was never going to get that license. And yet this was one of the most impressive believers that I ever encountered, because he had this deep and abiding sense that of God's love for him and God's transforming power in his life. And I don't know who, I met him long after he was a believer. I only spent a very short amount of time with him, but whoever delivered the gospel to him didn't deliver it through a 2-hour YouTube video. They delivered it through some very different means, right? And the reality is that there's a large proportion of the human population that you're not going to reach by intellectual argument. And if we believe that these people are bought with the blood of Jesus, we have an obligation to communicate the gospel, not just through intellectual arguments, but through means that can actually connect with people like this.
Another aspect of physicality that is probably neglected apart from our appearance is, I think, ritual and physical, like body position, things like this. I guess in my sort of slightly Victorian Baptist upbringing, there was at least you stood to sing, and in a way there was a reverence to that. So I don't want to do down one particular denomination. So different groups express this in different ways, and probably we could all learn from each other. The very charismatic approach of like, and I'm not dancing around and hands in the air and so on, in its own way is expressing the joy of the Lord, and I think likewise probably we could all learn a little bit from that. But also I think the kind of
and I'm not making the case for one particular aesthetic presentation. I'm making the case that you should have an aesthetic presentation.
Yes, think about it. Like, be deliberate. Choose how you're going to act as much with as much care and precision as you can. Don't just be precise in your speech. Be precise in your actions. There's some discussion of whether yoga. I don't really know anything about yoga. I have heard that there is something really to be avoided there. But
it's got a history. It's got a history in, I think it's the Hindu religion.
Okay.
So it's a rabbit hole, not for this stream, but can you religiously appropriate somebody else's aesthetic practice? I have no idea, but I would certainly be careful doing it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's call it there. Thank you very much, Black Horse, for joining me for this. Someone asked, "Are there going to be more of these?" I'd like to do more.
I think I'm up for a few more if you are.
Great. In that case, keep your eyes peeled. Thanks everyone for joining and being a nice lively comment section. I've enjoyed watching a bit of back and forth while we've been talking. And we should be having the normal Saturday night stream tomorrow night. So join me in about 24 hours, and I'll have hopefully collected an exciting panel and a new new chapter of God's word to look into. Oh, Black Horse, do you want to close us in a quick prayer?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Father God, we come before you tonight in the name of your Son. We worship you that while we were still sinners, you died in our place to pay the penalty for our sin. God, I pray that as we go from this experience, that we would have a deeper and more abiding knowledge of what it means to say that you paid for our sins, to say that you call us your sons and your daughters. Father, transform our hearts that we would be remade into the image of your Son, that our lives would be to the praise of your glory, that we would offer our bodies as living sacrifices to you. Father, thank you for this time we've had together. Thank you for this broadcasting platform. And I pray that you would take this time offered onto your name and use it to forward the glory of your kingdom. All this we ask in the name of your Son. Amen.
Amen.